So, Princess Anne just reopened Queen Camilla's official duty calendar, and she has frozen the palace successor who quietly rewrote it. And the part that I genuinely can't stop thinking about isn't that a calendar got changed, it's that whoever changed it used Camilla's own initials to cover the tracks. 11 cancelled engagements sit on that calendar. Beside every single one are two letters C period, C period, as if Camilla herself picked up a pen and crossed out her own duty. For months, the public assumed something simple. Camilla had scaled back. Age had thinned her workload the way it does for every working royal eventually. Nobody asked who actually pressed cancel. Now somebody has asked, and the answer is not what anyone expected. A single correction slip landed on Anne's desk a few weeks ago. Almost nobody outside a household office has ever heard of that kind of paper. It did not explain anything, it simply admitted something was wrong. Hold on to that detail. By the end of this, you will understand why one piece of paper the size of a postcard terrified a woman. She was 3 weeks from a quiet retirement. This whole story comes down to one plain fact. The calendar remembers everything, whether the people writing it want it to or not. Now look, if you're new here on Throne Files, hit subscribe so you don't miss any updates on this story. This one is far from finished. Here is the thing about a royal calendar. It looks almost boring from the outside. Just dates, initials, a few abbreviations, nobody outside the household understands. But inside Buckingham Palace, that calendar is currency. It decides who gets public credit for showing up, and it decides who quietly gets blamed for staying home. Two women in this story understood that currency better than anyone else drawing a household salary. The first is Princess Anne. She has spent 5 decades treating the household record like scripture, not sentiment. Her office keeps what staff privately call the sealed archive. It is a locked cabinet of duty books stretching back into the 1970s. Every year, it gets cross-checked against the court circular. That is the palace's own daily record of royal engagements, published each evening for the public to read. Anne does not trust memory. She trusts paper, ink, and a signature that can be traced to one hand. That is precisely why, when something in the digital system near Camilla's office began behaving strangely, it was Anne's desk the warning eventually reached. The second is Nadia Crest. She was hired 8 months ago to modernize the household's aging diary operation before Camilla's longtime scheduling clerk retired. Nadia inherited something the office calls the grid. It is an internal digital calendar that decides which cars get booked, which patronages receive a visit, and which cancellations get logged and why. Whoever controls the grid controls the record of what a working royal actually did with her week. The household runs its diary and correspondence operation on 19 full-time staff. Nadia was the only one among them holding administrator rights to the grid's actual back end. For 8 months, she controlled it almost entirely alone. Almost nobody thought to ask what that kind of quiet, unsupervised authority might eventually cost. This is not the first time a royal calendar has been used as a weapon rather than a record. Long before Nadia Crest ever touched the keyboard, Diana learned exactly how ruthless scheduling could be. An engagement could be shifted, delayed, or erased entirely. That single move controlled who received the credit and who absorbed the blame. Elizabeth despised that kind of manipulation with a quiet, permanent fury. She once told a private secretary something that is still repeated in that office today. A queen's diary is the one document that must never lie. Everything else in palace life can be denied, softened, or reframed. But a date either happened or it did not. That is the standard Anne inherited. She has spent her career enforcing it, long after Elizabeth herself was gone, with nobody left to check her homework but her own conscience. So when a calendar bearing Camilla's initials began contradicting itself, Anne was not reacting to gossip. She was reacting to a violation of a rule that runs back generations. That rule survived a princess's death and a queen's long widowhood without ever once being broken. Until now. Camilla found out the way most people find out something is deeply wrong with their own life, sideways by accident. She was reviewing an upcoming month of engagements at Clarence's house, alone, her tea gone cold, on the side table. That's when she noticed it, a cancelled hospice visit from 4 months earlier, carrying her own initials. She had no memory of cancelling it, none at all. She sat with the page a long moment, thumb resting on the two letters. Then she said quietly, to a room with nobody else in it, "I did not do this." Here is where the actual war begins. 8 months into her new job, Nadia Crest quietly built a second version of the grid. In her own private working notes, she called it the continuity file. She later described it as preparation for the transition into the next reign, whenever that distant day arrives. She kept it on a separate drive, accessible only from her own office terminal. Then she began entering revised versions of certain contested dates. Visits marked completed in the official grid were marked cancelled in her private file. Every single one of those cancellations carried Camilla's initials, as though Camilla herself had personally made each call. Nobody was ever meant to lay the two files side by side. That was the entire design, the quiet architecture of the deception. The public court circular told one version of events. The internal grid, seen only by a handful of senior aides, quietly diverged from it in small, deniable ways, and Nadia's private continuity file diverged from both of those records again. Three separate versions of the same 11 days, sitting in three separate places. Only one of them could possibly be true. Fiona Dunlow had logged Camilla's schedule by hand for 11 years before the grid ever existed. She was the last person left who still cross-checked the paper day book against the digital system every single week. That was exactly how she had been trained decades earlier. In September, running that exact check on what she assumed was an unremarkable Tuesday, Fiona found the first discrepancy. A hospice visit, logged as completed in her handwritten day book, appeared as cancelled in the grid, initialed C period C period. She read the entry twice, then she read it a third time. In Fiona's 30 years of experience, dates that disagree with each other are never an accident. Fiona did not confront anyone, not yet. She had 6 weeks left before retirement, and a pension she had no intention of gambling. 3 decades inside that system had taught her one thing: it quietly punishes people who raise alarms without proof. So she did the one thing her training had drilled into her for exactly this moment. She sealed it. Late on a Thursday evening, rain ran down the window of the small office that had been hers for over a decade. Fiona photocopied both calendars, the handwritten daybook, a fresh printout of the grid. She sealed them together in a single envelope, using the old wax stamp her department still kept for precisely this purpose. Across the seal, she wrote the date and her own initials in careful, deliberate handwriting. Then she filled out a correction slip. It is the one-page form every household office keeps folded in a drawer for exactly this kind of moment. In the box marked explanation, she wrote only 4 words. Discrepancy noted. Cannot explain. She did not name Nadia Crest anywhere on that form. She did not accuse anyone of anything. She simply refused to let a disagreement this precise disappear. So many small palace discrepancies quietly do, without a trace, without a witness, without a paper record anyone could hold up to the light later. On her second to last working day, Fiona carried the envelope down 2 flights of stairs herself, straight to Princess Anne's private secretary. Paper that actually matters, she had always believed, deserves to be carried by hand. Anne opened it that same evening. She read the 4 words twice. Then she pulled the master grid access records for the same 11 contested dates. What she found was exactly what Fiona had suspected but never dared write down. 3 of the 11 entries had been altered 9 days after Fiona's own last authorized access to that section of the system. Someone else had gone in after her, someone using a login Fiona did not recognize and had never been issued. That is the moment this stopped being a filing error and became a formal inquiry. Anne did not go to Camilla first. She did not go to Nadia Crest either. She went straight to the household's technical office and requested something nobody there could remember ever being requested before: a complete access log for the grid, covering all 8 months since Nadia Crest had taken over the household diary. What came back confirmed the worst version of Fiona's unspoken fear. Every login to the grid automatically carries a timestamp and a staff identification number. That record is quietly kept, but never shown to the ordinary clerks who use the system every day. Nadia Crest's identification number appeared against all 3 altered entries. Every edit was made late at night, well outside her normal working hours. Each one converted a completed visit into a cancellation and stamped it with Camilla's initials instead of her own. The pattern was not careless. It was, in its own way, precise. Anne asked her senior information officer to pull the entire 8-month log overnight rather than wait for a scheduled review. Her name was Priya Aluwalia, careful and unflappable by reputation. Priya had spent 11 years auditing household systems nobody outside that corridor ever thinks about. She delivered the printout the next morning in a single sealed folder, 91 pages long, every line time-stamped to the second. She did not offer an opinion on what it meant. She simply said the pattern was consistent, and that consistency, in her experience, is rarely accidental. Anne moved without warning anyone first. Within 48 hours, she issued a schedule approval freeze across the entire household office. No calendar entry, past or future, could be altered by anyone without direct sign-off from her own office. Diary clerks who had never once needed permission to log a routine change suddenly found themselves waiting on Anne's desk for a signature. Even a car booking now needed one. Nadia Crest's private continuity file was formally seized and copied in full. The sealed envelope Fiona had carried by hand became, officially, evidence rather than a curious anomaly. It was filed under Anne's own archive lock beside the household's oldest surviving duty books. The story had stopped being about 11 cancelled visits. It had become about who is allowed to write the official truth of a working royals week, and about what happens when that authority sits, unsupervised, in exactly one pair of hands. To be fair to Nadia Crest for a moment, succession planning inside a royal household is genuinely routine. Every new scheduling chief eventually drafts contingency documents for a future reign. A continuity file, on its own, is not inherently sinister. It is the initials and only the initials that make it indefensible. The night before her meeting with Anne, Nadia Crest sat alone in her flat 2 miles from the palace. An untouched glass of wine went warm on the kitchen counter. She ran through every possible explanation for a login she could not honestly deny. She told herself more than once that a continuity file was standard practice, that nobody had ever complained about a draft document before. But underneath that rehearsed calm sat a colder fear, one she did not say aloud even to herself. 8 months of careful positioning inside the household might collapse entirely over 3 lines in a log file nobody was ever supposed to read. Anne summoned Nadia Crest to her private office on a Tuesday morning, the same office where household disputes have quietly been settled for 50 years. Its walls are lined with framed engagement lists nobody outside the family has ever been permitted to photograph. Nadia arrived composed, a leather folder under one arm, prepared to explain a filing convention. Anne did not raise her voice. She rarely does. She simply placed the sealed envelope on the desk between them, its wax stamp unbroken, and asked one question. Why does a confidential continuity draft carry Camilla's initials on decisions Camilla never made? Nadia answered carefully, the way someone answers a line rehearsed in a mirror. The initials were simply a placeholder convention, she said, a habit carried over from an old spreadsheet template, meaning nothing more than continuity of format. Anne asked, just as evenly, why a placeholder convention needed to imitate one specific person's actual decision-making pattern across 11 separate dates. Nadia had no answer ready for that one. The silence that followed lasted long enough for a drinks trolley to be heard passing in the corridor outside. Nadia's counter-move, when it finally came, was polished, the way a prepared answer always is. She insisted the second calendar was never intended as an official record at all. It was, she said, merely a private planning document meant to help the next reign transition smoothly. Anne was treating routine internal paperwork, she suggested carefully, as though it were a criminal file. Initials on a draft document, she reminded Anne, carry no legal weight whatsoever. Technically, she was not wrong, but technically has never once been enough inside that building. Nadia, despite 8 months on the job, had clearly not yet learned that lesson. Then came the reversal. And it arrived exactly where reversals always arrive in this kind of story. Inside the smallest possible detail, the technical office worked back through the seized access log a second time at Anne's request. They found something Nadia herself had apparently overlooked. The grid's overnight synchronization system quietly backs up every entry to a secondary server each night at 2 in the morning. Buried inside those backup files sat an untouched original timestamp for each disputed date. It told a very different story than the one on the surface. 2 of the 3 disputed entries genuinely had been cancelled by Camilla's own staff, exactly as the public record always claimed. The reasons were entirely mundane. A scheduling clash, a short illness, nothing worth a headline. Fiona Dunlow's original handwritten notes on those 2 dates had simply gone slightly out of date. It was a small, human, forgivable error from a woman working her final months before retirement. That much cleared Fiona completely and without any doubt at all. But the 3rd entry told a completely different story, and it was the one that mattered most. The backup timestamp showed the hospice visit had, in fact, been completed exactly as Camilla remembered it. Camilla had attended. She had shaken hands, admired a garden. The residents had planted themselves and stayed 20 minutes longer than her schedule required. Then, 9 days later, at 11:40 at night, someone using Nadia Crest's login went back into that completed entry. They quietly converted it into a cancellation and stamped it with Camilla's initials, for no operational reason the technical office could ever identify. Anne called Camilla and Nadia into the same room together the following afternoon. She did something almost nobody in that building had ever seen her do before. She laid both calendars flat on the felt surface of the old household table, side by side. The handwritten daybook on the left, a fresh printout of the altered grid on the right, both open to the exact same date. Camilla read both entries in silence. On the left, in Fiona's careful hand, the word attended. On the right, in a font nobody could argue with, the word cancelled. Beside it, her own initials, applied by someone else's hand entirely. The room did not need raised voices. Camilla simply looked up from the page. She asked Nadia Crest quietly why her own initials appeared on a visit she remembered clearly enough to describe the garden. Nadia had no answer that survived contact with a timestamp. She didn't rewrite history, she just forgot ink doesn't erase. What Nadia Crest actually lost was not her job, and it was never going to be. It was something more permanent inside that building, unsupervised authority. Anne's freeze became a standing order rather than a temporary measure. From this point forward, every entry Nadia makes to the household grid requires a second signature from Anne's own office before it can take effect. It is a permanent counter-signature clause written directly into her role. The woman who once controlled the truth of a working royal's calendar entirely alone can no longer log a single cancellation alone. A witness must confirm it first. One signature used to move a queen's whole week. Now it needs two. She kept her office. She kept her title. She kept her salary and her desk near the household's technical wing. But she lost the one thing that had made her position genuinely powerful: the ability to alter the historical record of a working royal's life without anyone else in the building noticing until months later, if ever. Every future entry she makes will now sit beside another person's name, permanently, for as long as she holds the job. That is not disgrace. It is something quieter and, in its own way, harder to carry. A permanent asterisk beside her own signature for the rest of her career. The first countersigned form was processed on a Monday morning. It was an ordinary car booking for an ordinary Thursday visit, nothing that once would have taken Nadia more than 30 seconds to log alone. Instead, she filled it out and walked it to Anne's outer office herself. She stood by the window while an assistant checked the entry against the master grid. Only then did Anne add her own signature beneath Nadia's. Staff say Nadia has been seen making this walk at least twice a week since. Always alone, always without comment, a paper folder tucked under one arm. It is the same way Fiona Dunlow once carried her sealed envelope down that same corridor. The shareable scene happened 3 days after the confrontation, and people inside that office are already describing it to each other in low voices. The two calendars were formally transferred into Anne's sealed archive, alongside the household's oldest duty books. A junior archivist carried them down a corridor lined with portraits of household staff going back a century. She placed them into a single acid-free folder. Then she closed the drawer with the soft click a well-oiled lock makes when it seats properly. Nobody photographed it, nobody announced it, nobody explained it, but 3 household staff members who happened to be in that corridor have independently described the same detail since. The drawer closing sounded, in that quiet hallway, unusually final. The way a door sounds when everyone in the room understands it will not be reopened casually again. The cold verdict from inside that building has been repeated almost word for word by 3 separate sources close to the household. It is worth sitting with. The calendar remembers everything, even when the people writing it hope it will not. Here is the part almost nobody expected, and it is the genuine reversal of expectation in this story. 3 of the original 11 disputed dates remain, to this day, formally unresolved inside Anne's sealed archive. Not because nobody is looking. The backup system that saved everyone on the other 8 dates simply did not capture a clean timestamp for those final 3. It is a genuine technical gap, not a cover-up. Anne has refused to guess. She has refused to fill the gap with a convenient assumption, even one that would tidy the story into a clean ending. The correction file remains open. The 3 dates remain sealed under an unresolved marker. An independent chronologist has quietly been brought in to attempt a full reconstruction, a process expected to take months rather than weeks. Fiona Dunlow, meanwhile, retired exactly on schedule. Her pension stayed untouched, her final month's pay intact. And one addition arrived that nobody expected on her last day. A personal note from Anne, thanking her for 30 years of, in Anne's own words, refusing to let paper lie quietly. It now sits framed in Fiona's hallway, beside a photograph of her very first day at the palace. Camilla, for her part, has said nothing publicly. Privately, according to someone close to her, she has stopped